New York City and the state beyond it have more abandoned places than most Americans realize, a consequence of a dense, layered history that keeps producing infrastructure it then leaves behind. Hospitals, asylums, islands, military installations, tunnels, and entire neighborhoods that the city built and then forgot. Some of them are documented and managed. Some of them are structurally dangerous. Some of them have histories specific enough that the people who grew up near them have specific things to say about going there alone. These are the 10 abandoned places in New York that locals warn you don't go alone. Number 10, Hart Island, Pelham Bay, the Bronx. Hart Island is a 101-acre island in Long Island Sound accessible only by ferry from City Island in the Bronx, and it has been New York City's Potter's Field, its burial ground for the unclaimed dead, since 1869. The island's history spans a Union Army prisoner of war camp during the Civil War, a women's insane asylum, a tuberculosis hospital, a reformatory for boys, a drug rehabilitation center, and a missile launch site during the Cold War before settling into its current function as the largest municipal cemetery in the United States. Approximately 1 million people are buried on Hart Island, in trenches dug by Department of Corrections prisoners from Rikers Island. The burials are still occurring. Hart Island continues to receive bodies of people whose remains go unclaimed or whose families cannot afford private burial, at a rate of approximately 1,000 burials per year in recent years. The COVID-19 pandemic period dramatically increased the burial rate in 2020, when drone footage of mass burials on Hart Island circulated globally and brought international attention to a place that New York City had effectively managed to keep invisible for 150 years. The island was transferred from the Department of Corrections to the Department of Parks and Recreation in 2021, and limited public access was established. Families of people buried there can now visit by ferry on scheduled days. The general public can access certain areas. The full island, with its crumbling institutional buildings, the rows of numbered grave markers, and the specific atmosphere of a place that has accumulated 150 years of human misery, remains restricted. The prohibition on solo visits is less a legal restriction than a practical observation. A remote island with unstable structures, no emergency services access, and the specific weight of what it contains is not a place to be alone. Number 9, Willowbrook State School, Staten Island. Willowbrook State School was a New York State institution for children with intellectual disabilities, opened in 1947 in the Willowbrook neighborhood of Staten Island, and intended to house approximately 4,000 residents. By the 1960s, it held approximately 6,000 people, 50% over capacity in buildings that were designed for a different population and a different era of institutional care. The conditions that existed at Willowbrook became the subject of national attention in January 1972, when television journalist Geraldo Rivera, then a local reporter for WABC-TV, entered Willowbrook with a cameraman and broadcast footage of the conditions inside. The footage showed residents in conditions of neglect, understaffing, and inadequate care that Rivera described as a warehouse rather than a school. The broadcast was one of the most significant pieces of investigative journalism in American television history and directly contributed to the Willowbrook Consent Decree of 1975, a federal court order requiring New York State to reform the care of people with disabilities that became a foundational document in the deinstitutionalization movement. The institution closed in 1987, partially under the pressure of the consent decree and partially because the model of large congregate institutional care had been replaced by smaller community-based programs. The main buildings of the Willowbrook campus are now part of the College of Staten Island, which opened on the site in 1993. Several of the original Willowbrook buildings remain on the campus perimeter in various states of abandonment. Brick institutional buildings from the 1940s that were never repurposed and that have been deteriorating for nearly 40 years. Number 8, North Brother Island, East River, New York City. North Brother Island is a 20-acre island in the East River between the Bronx and Rikers Island that has been off-limits to the public since the last institution on it closed in the early 1960s. The island's history is one of the more specific and documented in New York's catalog of abandoned places. Riverside Hospital opened on North Brother Island in 1885 as a quarantine facility for infectious disease, specifically smallpox and typhoid fever. Mary Mallon, the cook who became known as Typhoid Mary, was confined on North Brother Island twice, from 1907 to 1910 and again from 1915 until her death in 1938. The island was her home and her prison for the last 23 years of her life. She is buried in Westchester, but the cottage where she lived out her quarantine exists on North Brother Island in various states of decay. On June 15, 1904, the steamboat General Slocum caught fire in the East River while carrying members of St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church on an excursion. The General Slocum attempted to beach on North Brother Island, and approximately 1,021 people died. The worst maritime disaster in New York City's history, and one of the largest loss-of-life events in the city's history before the September 11th attacks. The passengers were primarily German-American women and children from the East Village neighborhood, and the deaths were concentrated enough to effectively end the German-American community of Kleindeutschland in the East Village. The island received the burning ship. The dead are not there, they were buried elsewhere. But the island received the event. The island is now a bird sanctuary managed by the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, with access restricted to authorized researchers and journalists. The Riverside Hospital complex, brick institutional buildings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, overtaken by vegetation over 60 years of abandonment, is in an advanced state of nature reclaiming structure that makes the island one of the most photographed restricted New York locations from the water. After Riverside Hospital closed as a typhoid and quarantine facility in the early 20th century, North Brother Island had a second institutional life as Riverside Hospital again, reopened in the 1950s as a treatment center for teenage heroin addiction, one of the first institutionalized treatment programs for adolescent drug users in the United States. The program operated from 1952 to 1963 and was considered a significant, if controversial, attempt to address the heroin epidemic that had developed in New York's low-income neighborhoods in the post-World War II period. The program's outcomes were modest, and it closed without having solved the problem it was designed to address. The island then closed entirely and has been off-limits for over 60 years. The buildings that housed both institutional functions, the original late 19th century quarantine hospital and the 1950s drug treatment facility, stand in the same state that the birds now share with the ruins: doors open, windows empty, vegetation growing through floor openings, trees emerging from former wards. Photographs taken by journalists and authorized researchers show interiors where decades of plant growth have made the distinction between inside and outside structural unclear. The specific reason locals know to say not to go alone, the island is surrounded by the East River's tidal currents, is accessible only by water, and has no emergency services of any kind. An injury on North Brother Island, in the absence of an organized research visit, would be addressed by whoever noticed the unauthorized boat mooring. Number 7. Bannerman's Castle, Polypel Island, Hudson River. Polypel Island sits in the middle of the Hudson River approximately 50 miles north of New York City, near the town of Fishkill in Dutchess County. The island and its castle ruins are visible from the Metro-North Hudson Line, which runs along the Hudson's eastern bank, and passengers who look at the right moment see what appears to be a Scottish castle deteriorating into the river, which is essentially what it is. Francis Bannerman VI, a Scottish-American military surplus dealer based in New York City, purchased the island in 1900 specifically to store the enormous inventory of surplus military equipment his business had acquired from the U.S. government following the Spanish-American War of 1898. Bannerman had warehouses in Manhattan, but had been asked to move his inventory of live ammunition and military ordnance out of the city. The island solution provided storage space and a promotional landmark, Bannerman designed the storage structures in a Scottish castle style to advertise his catalog business to passengers on the Hudson River Railroad. Francis Bannerman died in 1918. The family business declined through the 1930s. In 1920, a gunpowder explosion destroyed a substantial portion of the island's structures. A fire in 1969 gutted the remaining main building, leaving the roofless stone walls that are visible today. The island was acquired by New York State in 1967, prior to the fire. The Bannerman Castle Trust, a non-profit organization, now manages the island and operates guided boat tours during the summer season, including tours of the ruins. The tours operate on a specific schedule and require boat access. Visits outside of organized tours are not officially sanctioned. The island's structural instability, 105 years of weathering in the Hudson River climate with no maintenance from 1920 through the early 2000s, has left the surviving walls and structures in an unpredictable state. Sections have collapsed without warning. The specific recommendation against solo visits is structural rather than mythological. The castle is genuinely falling apart. Number 6. The Smallpox Hospital Ruins, Roosevelt Island, Manhattan. The Smallpox Hospital on Roosevelt Island, known as Renwick Ruin, after its architect James Renwick Jr., who also designed St. Patrick's Cathedral and Grace Church in Manhattan, is a National Register of Historic Places listed Gothic Revival ruin at the southern tip of Roosevelt Island, the narrow island between Manhattan and Queens in the East River. The hospital was built in 1856, when Roosevelt Island was known as Blackwell's Island, and served as New York City's smallpox quarantine hospital until smallpox vaccination reduced the disease's incidence sufficiently to make a dedicated quarantine hospital unnecessary. The building was subsequently used as a nurse's dormitory and then abandoned in 1950. For 55 years, it deteriorated without stabilization on the southern tip of a relatively obscure island. The Queensboro Bridge passes overhead, and the island was primarily home to a prison and several other institutions, which limited residential development and public attention. The Roosevelt Island Tramway opened in 1976, bringing the island into daily connection with Midtown Manhattan and eventually leading to significant residential development. The Renwick Ruin was partially stabilized in 2005. The stone walls were consolidated, a drainage system was installed to prevent further water damage, and the ruin was incorporated into a small park at the island's southern tip that is publicly accessible. The stabilization is partial. The structure is a ruin, roofless, with open interior space and original stonework from 1856 that has been weathering for 75 years since the building's abandonment. The park around it is accessible during daylight hours. The building's interior is not accessible to visitors, and the condition of the masonry makes proximity to the walls under conditions of extreme temperature change. Very cold, followed by thaw, very hot and dry, followed by rain, a specific structural concern. Number 5. The psychiatric wards of Central Islip State Hospital, Central Islip, Long Island. Central Islip State Hospital in Central Islip, Suffolk County, Long Island, opened in 1889 and was at its peak one of the largest psychiatric institutions in the United States, housing approximately 10,000 patients on a campus of approximately 950 acres. The campus operated on the colony plan of psychiatric hospital design, a dispersed arrangement of smaller residential buildings, farms, greenhouses, and industrial facilities intended to create a self-sufficient therapeutic community rather than a single large institutional structure. At its peak, Central Islip State Hospital had its own railroad station on the Long Island Railroad, its own water supply, its own power plant, its own police force, and its own post office. The campus produced most of its own food through a working farm. The colony model was a genuine attempt at humane institutional care by the standards of its era, and the dispersed campus plan produced extraordinary architectural variety: Gothic Revival administration buildings, Colonial Revival staff housing, and utilitarian patient wards from multiple decades of construction. Deinstitutionalization in the 1970s and 1980s dramatically reduced the patient population, and the hospital progressively closed its facilities. The last patients left in 1996. The 950-acre campus was transferred to multiple users. The central administrative area became the campus of the New York Institute of Technology's Long Island campus, which has been there since 1986. The baseball minor league team Long Island Ducks plays at Fairfield Properties Ballpark, built on former hospital land. But the substantial residential and ward buildings of the original campus, dozens of large brick structures from the 1890s through the 1940s, stand in various states of abandonment on the portions of the campus that were never repurposed. The abandoned ward buildings are accessible in a practical sense. The 950-acre campus is large enough that the active portions and the abandoned portions are not clearly delineated for someone walking the grounds. The specific danger is what it always is for large, abandoned institutional buildings: structural instability, asbestos from pre-1980s construction, lead paint, and the specific hazards of multi-story brick buildings with deteriorated floors and staircases. Number 4. Old Croton Aqueduct Trail, Westchester County. The Old Croton Aqueduct is a 41-mile masonry tunnel built between 1837 and 1842 to carry fresh water from the Croton River in northern Westchester County to Manhattan, solving the fresh water crisis that had been a periodic public health emergency for the city since its founding. The aqueduct was the engineering marvel of its age, a brick-lined tunnel approximately 8.5 feet high and 7.5 feet wide, carrying 90 million gallons of water per day along a precise 0.00176% grade that allowed water to flow by gravity the entire 41 miles from source to reservoir. The aqueduct was replaced by the new Croton Aqueduct in 1890 and decommissioned from active water service. The tunnel has been maintained in various conditions of access and managed as the Old Croton Aqueduct State Historic Park since the 1960s, with a walking trail on the surface following the aqueduct's route through Westchester from Croton-on-Hudson to Yonkers. The above-ground trail is accessible and well documented. The tunnel itself is a different matter. The interior of the Old Croton Aqueduct, the 1842 masonry tunnel, is accessible at several points through ventilation manholes and access hatches that punctuate the surface every few hundred yards. The tunnel interiors have been documented by urban explorers and historians. The conditions: brick masonry from 1837 to 1842 in varying states of integrity, standing water in sections, no lighting, occasional bat colonies. The tunnels provide ideal hibernation habitat, and the specific navigational challenge of an enclosed space that is not a simple corridor. The aqueduct curves, has grade changes, and has branch sections that can disorient someone without a detailed map. Going into the Old Croton Aqueduct tunnel alone is inadvisable for specific documented reasons. People have become disoriented inside and required rescue. The structural condition of the 180-year-old masonry is not uniformly inspected, and the ventilation system that originally served the aqueduct is not maintained for human occupancy. It is also, legally, not something you are authorized to do without specific permission from the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, which manages the Old Croton Aqueduct State Historic Park. The surface trail is a different matter entirely, and is one of the more pleasant hiking and running routes in Westchester County. The 26-mile trail follows the aqueduct's route from Croton-on-Hudson to Yonkers, passing through multiple communities, past the ventilation shafts and access hatches at regular intervals, through old-growth trees that have grown over the buried tunnel for more than a century, and alongside historic properties including the Lyndhurst Estate, a National Historic Landmark, and multiple 19th-century houses whose proximity to the aqueduct trail provides a specific historical context for each section. The ventilation shafts, octagonal or round stone structures that protrude slightly above the ground surface at regular intervals, are the most visible above-ground evidence of the tunnel below. The larger keepers' houses that supervised access to specific sections of the aqueduct still stand along the route, some of them in private ownership and some managed as part of the historic park. The aqueduct itself is one of the more significant pieces of early American civil engineering remaining in anything like its original condition, and the surface experience of walking it provides a different and more responsible engagement with the structure than entering the tunnel. Number 3. The Seneca Village site, Central Park, Manhattan. Seneca Village was a community of primarily African-American property owners and residents established in the 1820s and 1830s in what is now the western portion of Central Park, between approximately 82nd and 89th Streets on the park's west side. At its peak, Seneca Village had approximately 260 residents, 3 churches, African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, All Angels Church, and Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, a school, a cemetery, and a documented history of stable property ownership in an era when African American property ownership in New York was exceptional. In 1857, the city of New York condemned the land for Central Park and forcibly displaced Seneca Village's residents through eminent domain. The residents were compensated through the legal process, but the community was destroyed. The churches were demolished. The cemetery, which contained an unknown number of burials, was absorbed into the park, and the graves were not relocated. Seneca Village is not abandoned in the conventional sense. Central Park is one of the most visited parks in the world, drawing approximately 42 million visits per year. The site of Seneca Village is parkland that park visitors walk across every day. What is abandoned is the community itself, the documentation of its specific history, and the graves that are beneath the park's ground surface, whose exact locations are not all known. The Central Park Conservancy and Columbia University collaborated on a formal archaeological excavation of the Seneca Village site beginning in the late 2000s, producing a documented record of the community that had been largely erased from New York's public historical memory for over 150 years. The site is now interpreted with historical markers. The graves that may remain beneath the surface are not accessible, are not marked, and are the specific reason that the site carries weight beyond any other park ground. Number 2. Floyd Bennett Field, Brooklyn. Floyd Bennett Field was New York City's first municipal airport, opened in 1931 in the Jamaica Bay area of southeastern Brooklyn. Named for the aviator Floyd Bennett, who had been the pilot on Richard Byrd's flight to the North Pole in 1926, a claim that has been contested by aviation historians. The airport was a significant piece of aviation infrastructure in the early commercial aviation era, serving as the base for multiple record-setting flights during the 1930s. Howard Hughes departed from Floyd Bennett Field in July 1938 on his record-setting around-the-world flight, completing it in 3 days, 19 hours, and 17 minutes, breaking the previous record by more than 4 days. Douglas Corrigan also departed from Floyd Bennett Field in July 1938, officially bound for Los Angeles, arriving in Dublin the following day and claiming he had misread his compass, an explanation that produced the nickname Wrong Way Corrigan and widespread disbelief. The airport was used by the military during World War II and was decommissioned as a civilian airport in 1971 when LaGuardia and JFK absorbed New York's air traffic. The National Park Service incorporated Floyd Bennett Field into Gateway National Recreation Area in 1972. The original terminal building, the hangars, and the runways are still present. The runways are used for model aircraft flying and for camping, but the majority of the infrastructure is in various states of documented abandonment. The specific concerns at Floyd Bennett Field: the hangars contain documented contamination from decades of aviation fuel and aircraft maintenance chemicals. The site has had PCB contamination documented in specific areas. The terminal building, the original 1931 Art Deco structure, has been in an extended restoration process. The vast open grounds, the salt marsh surroundings, and the specific remoteness of the Jamaica Bay location, 30 minutes from Midtown but as isolated as any place in New York City, make it the specific kind of location where going alone in the late afternoon means being alone as darkness falls, with no reliable cell service and no emergency services nearby. Number 1, Letchworth Village, Thiels, Rockland County. Letchworth Village in Thiels, Rockland County, approximately 30 miles north of New York City, is the most historically significant and most atmospherically specific abandoned site in the New York state system, and it has a specific medical history that gives it its particular weight. The institution was designed by architect William Weldon and opened in 1911 as the Letchworth Village State School for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic, a title that carries the specific cruelties of early 20th century institutional language. The campus, designed on the colony plan over approximately 2,300 acres of Hudson Valley farmland, was intended to provide humane care for children and adults with intellectual disabilities and epilepsy in a pastoral, semi-agricultural setting that separated them from what was understood, at the time, as the overstimulation of urban life. The specific event that gives Letchworth Village its place in medical history occurred in 1950. Dr. Jonas Salk, then developing what would become the first effective polio vaccine, conducted human trials of an early version of the vaccine on children at Letchworth Village. The first injections of polio vaccine in any human being were given to children at Letchworth Village in 1950. Children who did not have the legal capacity to consent, and whose parents or guardians may not have fully understood the experimental nature of what was occurring. The children at Letchworth Village were chosen because they were institutionalized, available, and considered expendable in a way that children in the general population were not. The institution began closing in phases from the 1970s onward and was fully closed in 1996. The 2,300-acre campus has been largely abandoned for nearly 30 years. The main buildings, large brick and stone structures from 1911 through the mid-20th century, stand in advanced states of decay, with collapsed roofs, broken windows, and the specific interior condition of buildings that have not been maintained for 3 decades in a wet climate. The land around the buildings has been partially developed into Haverstraw-Stony Point Quarry Park and other uses, but the core institutional campus remains. The scale of the Letchworth campus is disorienting to people who visit expecting a single building or a small cluster. The original colony plan distributed residential cottages, industrial workshops, a greenhouse, a school building, a hospital, an administration building, and staff housing across the full 2,300 acres. At peak operation, Letchworth housed approximately 4,000 residents, a population larger than most Hudson Valley towns. The colony was nearly self-sufficient. It operated a working farm, a dairy, a laundry, a power plant, and its own water system. The specific physical danger of the site. The residential cottages and ward buildings used construction methods from 1911 to the 1950s that included asbestos insulation and lead paint as standard materials. 30 years of weather penetration through failed roofs has spread these materials throughout the interiors. Floors in several of the larger buildings have partially or fully collapsed. The 2,300 acres of grounds include several ponds and water features from the original design that are not marked or fenced. The access situation is genuinely complex. Portions of the campus have been converted to Haverstraw-Stony Point Quarry Park, which is publicly accessible. The institutional building cluster itself is on land that has changed ownership multiple times, with portions held by Rockland County and portions privately owned, and the legal status of visiting the building interiors is not straightforward. People visit regularly. The documentation of the site by urban explorers and photographers is extensive. But visiting alone means no one knows you are there, in a location where a fall through a compromised floor would leave you without cell service and without a reliable way to signal for help. As urban explorer and preservationist Sean O'Boyle, who documented Letchworth Village in his work on abandoned American institutions, described what remains. The buildings at Letchworth hold the specific history of every place like it in America. The good intentions, the institutional failures, the specific individual people who lived and died inside them and were forgotten the moment the door closed. Being there alone doesn't make it more interesting. It makes it more difficult to process. 10 places. A potter's field that has buried 1 million people. An island where Typhoid Mary died. Castle ruins built from an arms dealer's ambition. A ruin where smallpox patients were quarantined. A psychiatric campus the size of a small town. A 19th century water tunnel running under Westchester. The buried graves of a destroyed community in Central Park. An airport where Howard Hughes flew around the world. And the institution where Jonas Salk first vaccinated human beings with the polio vaccine. New York's abandoned places are not just ruins. They are specific histories of what the city chose to do and chose to forget. Hit that like button and subscribe. More content like this coming.